In the last episode of this series, we started to look at constructing a reasoned system for correcting posture. What we needed to get started were the axioms of what we consider improvement. What is the good posture we're attempting to attain? This is a bit more complicated of a question than I let on, so let's dig right in. A system that is aimed at correcting posture is built on the premise that there is something wrong in your posture, and a change for the better is needed. Let's see how this change is defined in the conscious guidance and control system that I advocate for, as compared with the common strengthening and stretching system. In the strengthening stretching system, the basic idea is that muscle imbalances are the cause of poor posture, and so the solution is to rebalance the muscles through strengthening and stretching. If muscle imbalances are the problem, the obvious question becomes, how do we identify a muscular imbalance? We can see in diagrams like this that a muscular imbalance is portrayed as pulling a part of the skeleton out of place. It deforms the spine, shifts the pelvis, or drops the head in space. In the diagrams that show what good posture would be, we see these more normal-looking images. Now, I would argue that there are still clearly muscular imbalances, so to speak, in these images. For instance, in this image of poor posture, we see that the pelvis is portrayed as pulled forward and down, yet the image of good posture still shows the pelvis somewhat forward and down. Let's go to some images of real people. While sometimes you'll see images like this, where an increase in the bend of the back is purported to be improvement, you'll also find images like this, where there is a clear decrease in the bend of the back. If this is correction, why not go further? Why not straighten the lower back? Some of you might think, but there's supposed to be a bend in the lumbar spine. But how do we know this? Is it an axiom? Or perhaps the claim is that straightening the lower back would induce a muscular imbalance. If so, how was that determined? An axiom is accepted as true in order to build a system, but an axiom obviously can be wrong. If your axiom is wrong, you might build a very logical seeming system, but ultimately be hurting people, or perhaps helping them a little, but not nearly as much as you could. The claims around muscular imbalance are not based on real measurements of muscles. Instead, people work backwards. They see a person with a drooped head, and they deduce which muscle groups would be overactive and underactive in such a situation. The optimal position of the head is also not determined by some measurement of the muscles. It's assumed that this average sort of posture is correct, and deviation is imbalance. So it seems that perhaps the true axiom here is really that a sort of normative average posture is good, and that therefore, by definition, that is the posture where the muscles are balanced. That's kind of the trouble with basing your system around muscles. The entire musculature works together, and the muscles themselves change size and shape as they're used. While you may be able to see or demonstrate egregious imbalances, showing that the muscles are truly balanced borders on impossible. Remember, simply showing that a worse posture exists does not prove that a different posture is optimal. I agree that people often have wildly imbalanced muscles, but I would say a posture like this shows someone who should be included on that list. It seems obvious that the muscle groups that pull the lower rib cage back, for instance, are quite inactive, while the ones that pull them forward are overactive. To finish up with the strengthening stretching system, we can come back to our question. What is success? How do we know our muscles are balanced? When we look like this? Again, that seems to indicate that the true axiom is this model of posture. And if we asked why this model is right, 9 times out of 10 we'd be told that this is the posture where your muscles are balanced. I would say you want the axioms of your system to be bedrock, not a loop. In the conscious guidance and control system, the core guiding principle of what good posture is based on function. All the mechanisms of the body should function properly when you have good posture. Mechanism here means things like the breathing mechanism, the chewing, swallowing, digesting, and excreting mechanisms, the mechanisms of movement that we use to move around on our feet or manipulate objects with our hands. A system that improves some of the mechanisms of the body, but not all, would not be optimal. For instance, we wouldn't want to have controlled and unencumbered movement, but also have poor breathing. This idea of basing our system around function might at first blush sound a little broad, but we really do need something this all-encompassing. If your system and model are restricted to just the musculature, you can end up looking past things like the bones, the fascia, the tendons, and all the connective tissues of the body. You might also leave out your mind, which is surely instrumental in how you use your body. But this function principle does allow us to come immediately to a more narrow axiom for helping us define good posture. We want the connective tissues of the body, that is the tendons, ligaments, and most importantly the fascia, to be taut, as connective tissue needs to be taut and not slack to function. Now one might immediately think, didn't you just say narrowing to the muscles is a problem? How then can you narrow to the fascia and connective tissues? But let's examine how you get your fascia taut, because you cannot directly influence your fascia. You cannot tense or relax your fascia like a muscle. It's a so-called passive tissue. In order to make the fascia taut, you have to move the bones. A quick example here is that if you rotate the pelvis back and up away from the side of the knee, you will stretch the IT band, which connects from the knee to the point we call the iliac. In order to move the bones, you must use the muscles, and to direct the movement, you must in some way communicate with your body the specific movements that are needed. To get your fascia taut, you must use the musculature to move the bones according to a mental model. So while we can use the fascia as a measure of our success, it might be more accurate to say that the orientation and relative position of the bones is the crucial factor. Yet still, it requires the input of the mind and the use of the musculature to manipulate these things. So really, we are seeing a unity of mind and body, a kind of total view, to satisfy our desire to get the fascia of the body taut. Let's come back to the strengthening stretching model. We can see that they do say that balancing the muscles will change the position of certain bones, particularly the spine. Maybe they would argue that balancing the muscles will make the fascia taut. Yet when we look at both their models and their examples, we see that the IT band is slack because the pelvis is pushed forward and tilted down. We see that the thoracolumbar fascia is slack because the lower back is pushed forward and the rib cage is lowered in space. To get the IT band and the thoracolumbar fascia taut, we would need to rotate the pelvis back and up and move the midsection back. This will mean the legs are no longer leaning and the torso is no longer bent. That will increase your stature. It will also make the psoas fascia taut. So those who support the strengthening stretching model will have to explain either why fascia ought to be slack or why this configuration would lead to muscular imbalances. I don't think they can do either. The reason the strengthening stretching model doesn't consider this configuration is because it's impossible to attain through strengthening and stretching. Part of the reason that's the case is because those exercises and stretches will be engaged in while the person is in their habit and shortening. So even if you agree with the strengthening stretching system's model, it seems clear that it cannot account for the fascia. Whereas it's very easy to explain why muscles would be imbalanced according to the conscious guidance and control system's model. If your bones and bony structures are contorted, the muscles will obviously be shortened in some places and overly lengthened in other places. Because the fascia is slack and not taut, the muscles will also lack the leverage they get from the fascia. Taut fascia resists the pull of muscles that are connected to it. Limp fascia does not provide the same leverage, so the muscles end up working in peculiar ways, and in many cases overwork, which will necessarily lead to other muscles being underused. We've now looked at the axioms undergirding our understanding of what good and bad posture are. and there will be more axioms that help us build out our rules and methods. But in preparation for the next episode in this series, I have 2 questions for you to consider. First, are there some rules we can immediately generate based on this premise of function, and in particular the function of the fascia? And secondly, what is reasoning? I know that might sound broad or philosophical, and it is in a sense, but we need to investigate this a bit to make sure we're on a solid path to building an effective system. Some of you may have a feeling that you just want to fix your posture, and so you want the practicalities and not this theory. But I think you'll find this kind of theory will help you develop meaningful and practical methods for changing and improving your posture. So give it some thought, then join me next episode, and we'll start generating some rules for our system.